My name is Olivia Hayes. I'm 31 years old, and 3 weeks ago, I stood on the porch of the only house I have ever truly called home, in a quiet, tree lined neighborhood in Denver, Colorado, while my stepmother explained to me, slowly and sweetly, that I was no longer welcome inside. She said it the way people say things when they think they hold all the power, calm, almost kind, like she was doing me a favor by being so reasonable about it. "Olivia, sweetheart," she said, arms crossed over a cashmere cardigan I happen to know cost more than my monthly rent used to. "Your father and I have decided it's time you respected boundaries. This is our home now. You're always welcome to visit with notice, like any other guest. Guest. In the house where I learned to walk. In the house where my grandmother taught me to can tomatoes every August. In the house whose deed at that very moment, sitting in a fireproof lockbox 11 miles away, had my name on it. Not my father's. Not hers. Mine. She didn't know that yet. Before I tell you what happened after that, tell me something first. What time is it where you are right now? And where are you watching this from? I think about that a lot. How far a story like this can travel once it leaves the place where it actually happened. Because when people hear what I'm about to tell you, they always assume the cruelty started with one dramatic moment, one slammed door, one scene on a porch in the cold. It didn't. It started the way these things always start. Small enough to excuse. Repeated long enough to become normal. And if you've ever felt yourself slowly disappearing from a place that was supposed to be yours, I think you already know exactly the kind of slowness I mean. My grandmother, Eleanor Hayes, bought that house in 1979 with money she earned working 2 jobs after my grandfather left her with 3 kids and a stack of unpaid bills. She raised my father in that house. She raised me in that house too, for the 4 years after my mother died of ovarian cancer when I was 8, while my father tried and mostly failed to hold himself together. I remember my grandmother's hands more than almost anything else from that time. Flour on her knuckles. The smell of her kitchen on Sunday mornings, cinnamon and burnt sugar and something underneath it that I could never name but always associated with safety. The way she'd sit with me on the back steps in the evening and tell me that a house isn't 4 walls. It's the people who refuse to let it fall apart. I was 8 years old, recently motherless, sitting on cold concrete steps in the dark. And somehow that sentence made more sense to me than anything any adult had told me in the entire previous year. I held on to it the way you hold on to a single phrase that becomes a kind of anchor for your whole identity. When she got sick 8 years ago, she made a decision that, at the time, I didn't fully understand the weight of. She didn't leave the house to my father. She left it to me. In a trust, with conditions, with a lawyer she trusted in downtown Denver, with paperwork that took 11 pages to explain what amounted to one simple, devastatingly clear thing. This house belongs to Olivia. She told me why, the last time I saw her lucid, in a hospital bed with tubes that made her voice sound papery and far away, like she was speaking to me from underwater. "Your father loves easily and protects poorly," she said. "I need to know this house outlives both of our mistakes." I didn't know what she meant then. I held her hand and nodded and told her she didn't need to worry about any of that everything would be fine. The way you say things to dying people that you don't actually believe yourself. I understand what she meant completely now. I understand it with the kind of clarity that only arrives after you've lived through the exact thing someone warned you about. My father, Richard, is not a bad man. I want to say that clearly because this isn't a story about a villain father, even though there are moments in it where he behaves in ways that still make my chest tighten when I think about them. He's a gentle, somewhat passive person who has spent his whole life being loved by women stronger than him and mistaking that love for his own strength. My mother ran our household before she got sick. My grandmother ran his childhood and, in many ways, ran the early years of his adulthood too. And 5 years ago, Vivian started running everything else. He met her at a financial planning conference in Scottsdale, of all places. He came home talking about her before he'd even asked her to dinner. The way men sometimes do when they've met someone who makes them feel like the most interesting person in the room. She was sharp, polished, the kind of woman who walks into a space and immediately starts rearranging the furniture in her head before she's even taken off her coat. I liked her at first. I want you to know that too. I wasn't looking for a villain in this story. I was 26, still grieving my grandmother, working insane hours at a law firm downtown, trying to make partner before 30, and genuinely, deeply relieved that my father wasn't lonely anymore. I remember telling my best friend Mara over wine one night that Vivian seemed put together in a way Dad has never managed to be on his own, and meaning it as a compliment. The house had been left to me, but I never moved into it full time. I was building a career. I had an apartment closer to downtown, closer to the office, closer to the version of my life I was constructing brick by brick the way you do in your 20s when you're trying to prove something to yourself. My father lived in the house. My house. Rent-free, because that's what my grandmother had wanted. And because charging your own grieving father rent felt monstrous to me at the time. I paid the property taxes quietly every year, transferring money in March without fanfare. I paid for a new roof in 2021 after a hailstorm tore through the neighborhood. I paid for the foundation repair after a bad freeze cracked the basement wall 2 winters ago, signing a check for $9,000 without telling anyone except my accountant. None of it complicated. None of it announced. I just took care of what was mine, the way you take care of something you love without needing applause for it. Vivian moved in 2 years after she married my father. At first, the changes were the kind you'd expect. New curtains in the living room, heavier, more expensive looking than the ones my grandmother had hung. A different smell in the hallway, some candle she liked, something with sandalwood and citrus that quietly replaced the lavender my grandmother always burned. The lavender that, for years, I associated with the specific feeling of walking through that front door and exhaling for the first time all day. She redid the kitchen the following spring, which I let happen even though it gutted something in my chest to watch my grandmother's countertops. Pale yellow laminate, scratched in places from decades of use, with a small chip near the sink where I'd once dropped a cast iron pan at age 12, get torn out and hauled away in a contractor's truck while I stood in the driveway pretending to check email on my phone so no one would see my face. I told myself it was fine. I told myself a house should evolve, that holding a space frozen in amber for a dead woman wasn't healthy for anyone, least of all my father, who still had to live there. I told myself a lot of things to avoid an uncomfortable conversation with my own father about the fact that his wife was slowly renovating a home that legally belonged to his daughter, a fact he had apparently decided was either irrelevant or simply too inconvenient to keep mentioning out loud. That was my first mistake, and I want to name it plainly, because I think a lot of people watching this are making the exact same one right now without realizing it. Silence feels like generosity until it becomes the foundation someone else builds their entitlement on top of. By the 3rd year, Vivian had stopped referring to it as your father's house and started calling it our house, in a tone that left absolutely no room for correction, the kind of confident ownership that makes you doubt your own memory of events even when you have the paperwork sitting in a drawer to prove otherwise. She redecorated the guest room, my old childhood bedroom, the one with the slanted ceiling and the window seat my grandfather built before he left, into what she called a wellness studio, with a yoga mat unrolled permanently against one wall and a sound bath machine on the dresser, and exactly 0 trace that a little girl had once slept there, scared of thunderstorms, with a nightlight shaped like a crescent moon that used to cast soft shadows across the ceiling. I visited every few weeks during those years, sometimes monthly when work got especially demanding, and each time I noticed things being quietly removed. My grandmother's photographs migrated from the main hallway, where they'd hung for decades in mismatched frames, to a single shelf in the laundry room, stacked 2 and 3 deep like afterthoughts. Her old rocking chair, the one with the worn left armrest from 40 years of her elbow resting there, disappeared into the garage for restoration, and never came back restored, never came back at all, until I genuinely started to wonder if it had been quietly sold or donated without anyone telling me. A quilt she made by hand over one entire winter, one with a small burn mark near the corner from a candle accident in 1994 that she always laughed about and called the quilt's only flaw, just like the rest of us, vanished entirely sometime during my 4th year of barely visiting. When I finally asked, months after I'd noticed it missing, Vivian said she'd donated some things to make space, since the house was finally starting to breathe. Finally starting to breathe. As though my grandmother's entire presence in that house, the woman who had built it, paid for it, raised two generations of this family inside it, had been some kind of suffocating obstruction that needed to be cleared out before the house could properly exist. I should have said something then. I keep returning to that thought, lying awake at night more often than I'd like to admit. I should have said something the exact moment she used the word breathing instead of disappearing, because that was the moment the lie fully crystallized into something with its own gravity. But here's the thing about families that train you: slowly, patiently, almost lovingly, to accept smaller and smaller versions of your own belonging. Your instincts scream long before your mouth catches up to them. And mine had been screaming, quietly, persistently, for at least 2 years before anything came to a head in a way I could no longer pretend not to notice. The real warning, the one I ignored at my own peril, came at Thanksgiving 18 months ago. Vivian hosted. She always hosted now, as though hosting itself were a form of ownership stamped fresh every holiday season, a renewable claim on territory. The table was beautiful, I'll give her that. Cloth napkins folded into shapes I didn't recognize. Place cards and calligraphy, a centerpiece that probably cost more than the turkey. Her sister came in from Phoenix that year. My father's old college roommate came with his wife, both of them laughing too loudly at jokes I didn't quite catch the beginning of. I brought a bottle of wine and the same green bean casserole my grandmother used to make every single year without variation, because some traditions you keep simply to keep someone alive a little longer in the room, even if no one else notices what you're doing. At one point, over dessert, Vivian's sister asked, perfectly innocently, how long Vivian and my father had owned the house. 5 years now, Vivian said smoothly, not even pausing over her pie. We got incredibly lucky, honestly. Denver real estate has exploded since then. We could probably sell for triple what we originally paid if we ever wanted to. I remember setting my fork down very carefully on the edge of my plate, the small clink of silver on china suddenly very loud in my own ears. You didn't buy this house, I said. My voice came out quieter than I wanted it to, thinner than I intended. My grandmother left it to me, in her trust. The table went still in that particular way a Thanksgiving table goes still when someone has said something true and deeply inconvenient in front of guests who came expecting wine and small talk, not a contested inheritance. Vivian laughed, light and dismissive, the kind of laugh specifically engineered to make you feel like you've made an ugly scene out of nothing at all. Olivia, sweetie, I know your grandmother loved you very much, and that's beautiful, but your father has lived here for decades. Legally, these things get complicated with old family properties. Let's not do this in front of company. Let's not do this in front of company. That phrase has haunted me in the months since, returning to me at strange moments, in the shower, driving to work, lying in bed at 3 a.m. Because what she was really saying, underneath the polite social correction, was, don't interrupt the story I am confidently telling about my own life, especially not with the truth. Especially not in front of people whose opinion of me actually matters. I let it go. Again. My father said absolutely nothing. Again, his eyes fixed somewhere on his plate, on his pie, anywhere but on me. And I drove home that night with my hands shaking on the steering wheel the entire way down I-25. Not from anger exactly, but from the particular vertigo of watching someone confidently narrate a lie about your own life while everyone around the table nods along like it's the most reasonable thing they've ever heard. That's the cruelty of betrayal dressed up as family harmony. Part of you keeps hoping, desperately, that you're somehow overreacting, because the alternative, that you're not overreacting at all, that something genuinely wrong is happening in slow motion right in front of you, is so much heavier to carry around every single day. So I started doing something I should have done years earlier. I started documenting, quietly, methodically, the way you'd build a case for something you weren't yet ready to admit you'd eventually need. I requested certified copies of the trust documents from my grandmother's attorney, a careful silver-haired man named Walter Greer, who had handled her estate for decades and remembered every detail of her wishes with a precision that almost made me cry the first time I sat across from him again. 8 years after her funeral, asking him to pull files he probably assumed he'd never need to revisit. I pulled the county property records, the ones anyone can technically access in about 10 minutes if they know exactly what to look for, showing the title history in plain black and white. No ambiguity anywhere in the language. Eleanor Hayes to Olivia Hayes, trust transfer, recorded, stamped, notarized, indisputable, sitting in a public database the entire time while a private fiction got told and retold at every family gathering. I photographed every single renovation receipt I had personally paid for over the years. The roof, the foundation. The new water heater after the old one flooded the basement 2 winters ago and ruined a box of my grandmother's old letters I'd been meaning to move upstairs. I kept every old email where my father had, almost in passing, referred to your house before Vivian's narrative had fully taken hold of him and rewritten his vocabulary entirely. One email from 4 years ago simply said, "Thanks for handling the roof on your house, sweetheart. I don't know what we'd do without you." I read that line probably 30 times over the following weeks, each time feeling something different. Comfort, then grief, then a slow-building anger I didn't quite know what to do with yet. A part of me hoped, genuinely, that I would never need any of it. That documenting was just an anxious habit, an overcorrection, a lawyer's daughter's nervous tick. I gave them every single chance not to make me need it. I visited less, not out of anger exactly, but out of a kind of self-protective exhaustion that I told myself, repeatedly, was simply being busy with work. Partner track doesn't leave a lot of room for weekend drives to Denver suburbs, I told myself. The truth, underneath that convenient explanation, was that the less I was there, the less I had to watch my grandmother's house being slowly converted into a stage set for a marriage I had no actual part in and had never been asked to participate in shaping. 3 weeks ago, I drove up unannounced on a Saturday morning, partly out of guilt for not visiting in over a month, partly because I'd left a box of my grandmother's old letters in the garage during a move 2 years prior and wanted them back before Vivian decided they were clutter too. The way she'd decided about the quilt, about the rocking chair, about so many small physical pieces of a woman she'd never met. I noticed the doormat first, a new one, replacing the faded welcome mat that had been there since before I could remember. This new one was monogrammed with a single elegant V in a flowing script font. No H for Hayes anywhere on it. Just Vivian's chosen initial sitting proudly on the threshold of a house she had never paid one single dollar toward in any capacity. I noticed the lock next. A new keypad system had replaced the old brass deadbolt my grandmother had installed herself in 1995. The one with a faint dent near the bottom where my father, as a teenager apparently, had once kicked the door in frustration over something nobody remembered the details of anymore. My key, the one I'd carried on my keyring for 8 years, didn't fit because there was no longer a keyhole for it to fit into. I rang the bell, standing on a porch that suddenly felt like someone else's property in a way it never had before, even during all the smaller erosions of the previous 3 years. Vivian answered in workout clothes, hair pulled back in a tight ponytail, looking mildly inconvenienced, like I'd interrupted something genuinely important rather than simply shown up at my own house on a weekend morning the way I'd done hundreds of times throughout my entire life. "Oh," she said, one hand still on the doorframe, not stepping back to let me in. "I didn't realize you were coming." "I didn't realize I needed to schedule it," I said, trying desperately to keep my voice light, almost joking. "I just wanted to grab a box from the garage. Is Dad around?" "He's at the gym." She didn't move from the doorway. She didn't invite me in, didn't step aside the way you instinctively do for family, the way you do without even thinking about it for someone who has walked through that door their entire life. "Olivia, can we talk for a second?" "Out here." That's when she said it. Standing on the porch in the cold November air, arms crossed, breath visible in small white clouds drifting between us, she told me that she and my father had been discussing boundaries, that my unannounced visits were disruptive to their peace, that going forward she'd appreciate if I called ahead, gave at least 24 hours notice, and treated the home with the respect you'd show any host whose space you were entering. Host. She used that word like a crown she'd already fitted carefully onto her own head, gold and certain and completely unaware that the crown was sitting on borrowed land. "This is my grandmother's house," I said, and I could hear how thin my voice had become, stretched over years of not saying this loudly enough. Not saying it at all, really. Just absorbing slight after slight like a sponge that had finally, completely saturated. It's actually legally— I know the history, sweetheart. She cut in, gentle and final, the way you'd correct a child who'd gotten a small fact slightly wrong in a school report, patient and faintly condescending. But your father lives here. I live here. You have your own apartment downtown. It's just healthier for everyone involved if we treat this like what it actually is. Our home. Your visiting place. Behind her, through the front window, I could see the new dining table she'd ordered the previous month. The one she'd posted on social media with a caption about finally making this house feel like ours after years of other people's leftover energy. Other people's leftover energy. She meant my grandmother. She meant me. She meant decades of a family she had married into and apparently decided to slowly, methodically replace rather than join. I didn't argue on that porch. I want you to understand that clearly, because I think the version of this story that feels most satisfying would have me shouting, citing statutes, pulling out my phone to recite property law at her in the cold November air. I didn't do that. I said, "Okay, I understand." The same quiet, controlled sentence people say when they understand far more than the other person standing in front of them realizes they understand. I drove home. I didn't cry until I got to my apartment, sat on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets, and finally let 3 weeks— no, honestly, if I'm being truthful with myself, 3 years of swallowed instinct come up all at once in a way that left me gasping between sobs like I hadn't cried since my grandmother's funeral. Then I called Walter Greer. "It's time," I told him, my voice still rough from crying. "I need everything pulled together. Title, trust, tax records, all of it. Everything you have on file." "Olivia," he said in that careful lawyer voice that somehow manages to be both warm and devastatingly precise at the same time. "I've been wondering when you'd call. Your grandmother always said this day might come eventually. She wasn't naive about your father's marriage, even from a hospital bed. She specifically asked me, the week before she passed, to make sure the trust would hold up against exactly this kind of slow erosion, whoever ended up causing it." That sentence undid something in me. Sitting alone on my kitchen floor at 9 in the evening on a Saturday, my grandmother had seen this years before it happened, had anticipated a version of this exact betrayal with a clarity I hadn't possessed myself until very recently. And some part of her, even from a hospital bed with tubes in her arms and a voice gone papery and thin, had trusted that I would eventually need the armor she'd quietly, deliberately built for me long before I knew I'd need it. Here's what I want you to sit with for a second, because I think about it more than almost anything else in this entire story, more than the confrontation, more than what happened after. How many of us are living inside arrangements someone else has slowly rewritten, simply because we were too polite, too grieving, too hopeful about family harmony to ever actually check the paperwork on our own lives? How many of us have a version of this exact lockbox somewhere, full of proof we've never had to use, hoping desperately we never will? I spent the next 9 days doing something that felt both clinical and strangely sacred at the same time. I built a file, late at night after work, sitting at my kitchen table with a glass of wine I mostly didn't drink. Trust documents. 11 pages exactly as I remembered. Title history pulled fresh from the county recorder's office, the dates lining up perfectly with everything Walter had on file. Every renovation invoice with my name and signature on it, the roof contractor's logo still visible in the corner of a PDF from 2021. Screenshots of old text messages where my father, years earlier, had written things like, "Thank you for handling the roof on your house, sweetheart. I don't know what we'd do without you." The message sitting there in blue and gray bubbles like a small, undeniable fossil of a truth everyone had since agreed to forget. Photographs of the original brass deadbolt, the one Vivian's new keypad had replaced, time-stamped from a home inventory I'd done after my grandmother's funeral specifically for insurance purposes. Long, long before any of this conflict ever began. Proof that even the smallest physical details of that house had been documented by me as the legal owner years before Vivian had ever set foot inside. Walter looked through all of it in his downtown office, glasses pushed up onto his forehead, methodically turning page after page, and finally set the folder down with a soft thud that somehow felt more dramatic than any courtroom scene I could have imagined. "This isn't ambiguous," he said, looking at me over the top of his glasses with an expression I couldn't quite read. "This is about as clean a case as I've seen in 30 years of estate law. The question isn't whether you can enforce your ownership, Olivia. That question was settled the day this trust was recorded 8 years ago. The real question now is how you want to do it." That was the actual decision sitting in front of me, the one that mattered far more than any legal technicality. Not whether I had the right. The law had already settled that 8 years earlier, in a hospital room I still dream about sometimes, the machines beeping softly, my grandmother's hand impossibly light in mine. The decision was about the kind of person I wanted to be on the other side of finally using that right. I want to pause here and ask you something, because I genuinely think it matters more than whatever plot twist you might be waiting for right now. Have you ever had a moment where you suddenly realized you held all the power in a situation, all of it, completely, and the most tempting thing in the entire world was to use every single ounce of it as cruelly and as suddenly as it had been used against you for years? I thought about it. God, I thought about it more than I'm comfortable admitting on camera. I imagined Vivian's face if a sheriff's deputy showed up with an eviction notice on some random Tuesday afternoon. No warning at all. Just consequence arriving the exact way she'd arrived in my life. Uninvited, certain of her own righteousness, and completely impossible to ignore. But that's not who my grandmother raised me to be. Even from the brief, fierce periphery of those 4 years she had me as a frightened, motherless 8-year-old. And it's not who I wanted to become, standing in the wreckage of someone else's cruelty, just because the wreckage happened to finally be mine to detonate. So I chose something different. Something that would still need to be devastating, because gentleness alone wasn't going to undo 3 years of slow, deliberate erasure. But something that would let the truth do the heavy lifting instead of letting vengeance do it for me. I asked Walter to draft a formal letter. Not an eviction. A notice of trust ownership and a request for a family meeting, sent simultaneously to my father and to Vivian, copied to absolutely no one else, giving them both the dignity of hearing the full truth privately, in writing, before anyone outside our immediate family ever had to know any of it. It arrived on a Thursday. I know the exact day because my father called me 40 minutes after the courier left, his voice shaking in a way I hadn't heard since the week my mother died, 23 years earlier. "Olivia," he said, breathless, almost frantic. "Is this real? This letter, Walter Greer's letterhead, is the house actually—" "It's been mine since Grandma died, Dad," I said, as gently as I could manage while sitting at my desk at work, my office door closed, my heart pounding against my ribs. "It's always been mine. I never lied to you about it, not once. I just stopped correcting the lie every time someone else told it." There was a long silence on the line, long enough that I almost asked if he was still there. I could hear him breathing, the particular sound of a person recalculating decades of comfortable assumptions in real time, in real, painful seconds. "Vivian's going to be furious," he finally said, and even in that single sentence, I could hear exactly where his instinct went first. Automatically. The way water finds the lowest point. Not to me. Not to the years of small, accumulated erasures I'd quietly absorbed. To managing his wife's reaction. "I know," I said, and something in my chest ached at how unsurprised I was by his response. "That's probably going to be the hardest part of this for you, Dad. But I need you to understand something clearly. This isn't me punishing you. This is me finally stopping a story that was never true, no matter how many times it got repeated at Thanksgiving tables." The family meeting happened 4 days later in Walter's office because I wasn't willing to have this particular conversation on the porch of a house someone had spent 5 years convincing herself was hers. Vivian arrived in a tailored blazer, composed, clearly ready for what she believed was simply an emotional overreaction she could manage with the right tone of voice. The same tone she'd used on me 100 times before, the one that made you feel slightly unhinged for having any feelings about your own erasure at all. That tone did not survive the meeting. Walter laid out the documents with the calm, almost surgical efficiency of a man who has done this hundreds of times and felt nothing personal about any of it. The trust, 11 pages, every clause exactly as written. The deed, the recorded transfer, dated and stamped. The tax records showing precisely who had actually paid for the roof, the foundation, the water heater, while Vivian had spent those same years posting about our home to an audience of several hundred followers online. I watched her face change in real time across that conference table, color draining slowly, almost theatrically, like watching a building lose power floor by floor in a city blackout. "This has to be some kind of mistake," she said, looking at my father instead of me, as though he might somehow rescue her from a fact that had already been notarized 8 full years before she had ever even met him. "Richard, tell her this is some kind of mistake." My father didn't say anything for a long, agonizing moment, and in that silence I watched something shift in him too. Not toward me exactly, not yet, but visibly away from the comfortable fiction he'd been living inside, rent-free in every sense of the word, for 5 entire years. "It's not a mistake, Viv," he said quietly, not looking up from the table. I think I knew, somewhere underneath everything, and I just let it get easier and easier not to think about it. Every year it got a little easier. "You let your daughter humiliate me," Vivian said, her voice rising now, the carefully maintained composure finally cracking into something sharper, more frightened than angry underneath it all. "She's been sitting on this for years, plotting, waiting for the perfect moment to—" "I asked you not to do this in front of company at Thanksgiving," I said, and I kept my voice level, because I had practiced this exact sentence in my car for 3 straight days before this meeting. "I told you the truth at your own dinner table 18 months ago in front of your sister, and you laughed at me and changed the subject without missing a beat. I have been telling the truth quietly for years, Vivian. I just finally stopped letting you overwrite it in front of an audience." She didn't have an answer for that. The room went quiet in a way that felt almost physical, like the air pressure had changed. Walter slid a single page across the polished table, a simple residential lease agreement drafted at my specific request the week before. "Olivia isn't asking anyone to leave the property today," he said, his tone perfectly neutral, perfectly professional. "She's offering a lease. Fair market terms, month to month, structured to protect both parties involved. This is entirely her decision to make, and she has chosen the considerably more generous path available to her under the circumstances." Vivian stared at the lease like it was an insult dressed up as kindness, and maybe, honestly, it was a little of both. "I won't pretend otherwise, even now telling you this. I don't need a lease for a home I already live in," she said, her voice tight. "You do now," Walter said simply, without any cruelty in his tone, just fact. "Because it's not your home, and it never was, legally speaking. It's hers. It has been hers since 2018. That sentence sat in the room for what felt like an extremely long time, the silence stretching out across the conference table like something physical you could almost touch. I want to tell you something honest here, something the satisfying revenge version of this story would probably skip over entirely. I didn't feel triumphant in that moment, watching Vivian's certainty crumble in real time. I thought I would. I had imagined this exact confrontation more times than I'm proud of admitting, usually with some version of me standing taller, speaking louder, finally winning in the way you win an argument you've lost 100 times already inside your own head while driving home alone from holidays that left you feeling smaller every single year. Instead, I just felt tired and sad, in a way I hadn't expected. Watching a marriage I'd had nothing to do with start cracking open right there in a lawyer's office because the foundation it had been resting on, quite literally in this case, had never actually been real to begin with. My father signed the lease that day, his hand visibly shaking slightly as he wrote his name. Vivian did not sign. She left the meeting without speaking to me directly, blazer still perfectly pressed despite everything. The only visible sign of anything being wrong being how tightly white her knuckles were gripping her car keys on the way out the door. For 2 weeks after that meeting, I heard almost nothing from either of them. My father called once, sounding hollow and distant, telling me he was staying at a hotel near downtown while things settled between us. I didn't ask what exactly that meant, because I had learned the hard way over many painful years not to try managing other people's marriages from the outside looking in. Then, 10 days ago, Vivian called me directly for the first time in over a year. I almost didn't answer. I sat with the phone buzzing insistently in my hand for 3 full rings, my thumb hovering uncertainly over the screen, every instinct in my body bracing for another performance of righteous indignation, another carefully constructed sentence designed to make me feel unreasonable for simply existing. I answered anyway, mostly out of curiosity and partly because some small, stubborn part of me still wanted to understand. "Olivia," she said, and her voice sounded different immediately. Smaller, stripped almost entirely of the polish I'd grown so used to over 5 long years. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to actually answer me honestly, not just be polite about it the way you usually are." "Okay," I said, sitting down slowly on the edge of my bed. "Did you ever, in 5 years, see me as anything other than someone standing in your way?" The question surprised me, genuinely, more than I expected it to. I had braced myself for anger, or for some new attempt at renegotiating the lease terms in her favor, or for another carefully worded accusation. I had not braced myself for something this honest. "I wanted to like you," I said slowly, choosing each word carefully the way you choose your footing crossing ice. "I did like you, actually, in the very beginning, before any of this. I think somewhere along the way you decided that loving my dad meant erasing the parts of his life that came before you ever arrived. And I let that happen for way too long, honestly, because I didn't want to be the difficult, bitter stepdaughter in everyone else's version of this story." There was a long quiet on the other end of the line, long enough that I wondered if she'd hung up. "My mother did almost exactly the same thing to my stepfather's daughters when I was a teenager," she said finally, very quietly, almost as if she were confessing something she'd never said out loud before. I watched her slowly erase 2 girls out of a house over about 6 years, piece by piece, photograph by photograph, until they barely visited anymore at all, until eventually they just stopped coming altogether. I remember telling myself, as a teenager watching all of it happen, that I would never become her. Never in a million years. She let out a small, broken laugh that didn't sound like laughter at all. I became her exactly. I just had better taste in throw pillows while I was doing it. I didn't say anything right away, because I didn't fully trust what was happening on the other end of this phone call. Self-awareness arriving this late doesn't undo years of accumulated damage, doesn't put my grandmother's quilt back together or bring the rocking chair back from wherever it ended up. But it does, I think, change what becomes genuinely possible moving forward if both people involved are willing to walk through that newly opened door. "I'm not going to pretend the last 5 years didn't happen the way they happened," I said carefully. "But I'm also not interested in making absolutely sure you lose everything, just because you finally, belatedly understand what you were doing the whole time. That's not the kind of win I actually want out of any of this." She signed the lease 2 days later. Quietly, no lawyers present this time, no further confrontation needed. My father moved back into the house shortly after. I still own it. I always will, for the rest of my life if I choose. My grandmother made absolutely sure of that long before any of us in this family knew we'd eventually need it. I went back 2 weeks ago for the first time since that difficult phone conversation, this time with a brand new key that actually fit a lock that had been thoughtfully restored to something closer to what it used to be, at my father's specific request, apparently. He had found the old rocking chair, untouched and slightly dusty, tucked into the far corner of the garage exactly where it had been left, and brought it back inside himself, setting it carefully near the front window where my grandmother used to sit with her coffee every single morning of her life in that house. Vivian was in the kitchen when I walked in that day. She didn't perform warmth, didn't reach for a hug or attempt some kind of dramatic reconciliation moment. She didn't perform exaggerated contrition either, which somehow felt more honest than if she had. She just said, "There's coffee on the counter if you want some," in a voice that sounded, for the very first time in 5 entire years, like an actual person speaking to me instead of a curated brand of practiced hospitality. I sat down at the table that wasn't my grandmother's original table anymore, in a kitchen that had been renovated past easy recognition, inside a house that would always, on every legal document and in every way that genuinely mattered, be mine. And for the first time in longer than I want to admit out loud, I didn't feel like a guest standing awkwardly in my own home, and I didn't feel like I was performing ownership either, defending territory with every word and gesture. I just felt, simply and quietly, like someone who had finally, completely stopped apologizing for the truth. I'm telling this entire story now because I think too many of us confuse keeping the peace with slowly, methodically disappearing. We think if we just stay quiet long enough, stay accommodating long enough, stay the unfailingly generous, bigger person long enough, the people erasing us piece by piece will eventually notice on their own and simply stop. They won't. Not on their own. Not without something forcing the issue into daylight. Erasure doesn't self-correct quietly in the background while everyone waits patiently. It only stops when the truth gets loud enough, clear enough, documented enough, that it can no longer be talked over comfortably at someone else's dinner table in front of guests who don't know any better. The lesson I learned, far later in my life than I probably should have, is that being kind and being silent are not actually the same thing, even though somewhere along the way I had let people quietly convince me they were identical. You can document the truth carefully without ever weaponizing it cruelly. You can protect what is legally and rightfully yours without becoming someone who takes delight in another person's complete downfall. And you can absolutely, without apology or hesitation, correct a story that someone else has been confidently, repeatedly telling about your own life, even when correcting it makes an entire dinner table go uncomfortably silent. If someone has ever made you feel like a guest in your own life, in a house, in a family, in a story that was rightfully and legally yours long before they ever showed up and started quietly rearranging the furniture, the photographs, the small irreplaceable pieces of someone you loved, I want you to hear this part clearly, more clearly than anything else I've said today. You don't need their permission to remember the truth exactly as it happened. You don't need their comfort or their approval to defend it when the moment finally comes. And you are never, under any circumstances, required to disappear quietly out of your own story, just because someone louder, more confident, more polished decided your continued presence was inconvenient to the version of events they preferred. So I'll leave you with the same question I keep quietly asking myself on nights when the house is finally still and the rocking chair creaks gently by the window. The exact way it did when I was small enough to believe, with my whole heart, that nothing could ever possibly take this place away from me. If someone tried to write you out of your own story, slowly, deliberately, one small erasure at a time, and one day you finally found the proof that the truth had been yours all along, locked away and waiting, would you regret finally saying it out loud, clearly, in front of everyone who needed to hear it?